CBS News presents Douglas Edwards with up-to-the-minute developments from all parts of the world. Mr. Edwards.
Good evening, everybody.
Douglas Edwards.
Direct from CBS News election headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening from our CBS News election headquarters in New York.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin.
Direct from CBS News Convention Headquarters in Miami Beach, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Charles Kuralt in the CBS Newsroom in New York. Eric Severide in Miami Beach, Charles Collingwood in London, George Herman in Washington, Marvin Kalb in Washington, Robert Pierpoint in Washington, and Daniel Shore in Washington.
Good evening. The deep split.
From CBS election headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Charles Kuralt in the CBS Newsroom, Bernard Kalb in San Clemente, Bob Schieffer in Mitchell, South Dakota, Barry Seraphin in Towson, Maryland, Terry Drinkwater in Rockville, Maryland, Jeff Williams in Ayrshire, Iowa, Jed Duval in Cheyenne, Wyoming, Richard Threlkeld in Prineville, Oregon, Bruce Dunning in Cat Lai, South Vietnam, and Bruce Hall in Miami.
Good evening. This was a day that comes every 4 years when the people of the United States choose one man to wield the greatest power given to any world leader. And it appears at this hour that...
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in New York, George Herman in Washington, Leslie Stahl in Washington, Fred P. Graham in Atlanta, Peter Kalischer in Paris, Tom Fenton in Paris, Robert Shackney in Des Moines. And tonight, a CBS Evening News special report, the energy crisis.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized...
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in Washington, Fred Graham in Washington, Bruce Dunning in Saigon, Peter Collins in Saigon, Bob Schieffer in San Diego, and Richard Wagner in San Francisco.
Good evening. President Ford said today...
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The last of the Apollos...
From around the world and from our headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Good evening. For different reasons, President Reagan's new round of spending cuts hit Capitol Hill and Wall Street with a...
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Good evening. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting from Washington, where President Reagan delivers his State of the Union message tonight amid a continuing tide of double-digit unemployment, rising...
This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. In Moscow and Beijing today, the world's two communist giants were each turning a page of history. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. A judge pronounced sentence today on the man Wall Street admirers once called Ivan the Terrible. Observers said...
Saddam Hussein agrees to negotiations in Washington and Baghdad. The Secretary of State calls them the last best chance for peace. And he says the message to Iraq will be pull out or risk disaster. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. A U.S. Environmental Protection Agency review panel tonight endorsed key sections of studies linking second-hand cigarette smoke to cancer. This is the CBS Evening News. Good evening, Dan Rather reporting. President-elect Bill Clinton today talked to some of the key people in Washington who could make or break what he calls his agenda for change.
Is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather and Connie Chung.
Good evening. The Republican...
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Good evening. The first troops of the United Nations...
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York. This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening.
This is the CBS Evening News with Bob Schieffer reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
The question everyone is asking.
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you tonight. For many Americans today, it was back.
This is the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor.
And good evening. The H1N1 virus, or swine flu, spread to more countries today, but in...
This is the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric.
Good evening, everyone. When air...
This is the CBS Evening News.
Good evening, I'm Maurice DuBois, and we begin tonight in Egypt, where the chaos on the streets appears to have formed.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
ISIS is taking its war of terror to the American homeland, or... If it's Tuesday, it's Beat the Press.
I've watched you on television. You're a real beauty.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Today, Donald Trump detailed millions of dollars that he's donated to veterans charities.